Neuroscience tells us with certainty that playing an instrument literally reshapes our brain. But something you might not know is that the way this actually happens is not the same for every instrument. So the brain of a guitar player and the brain of a drummer are rewiring themselves in completely distinct ways. And in today's video, I want to talk about what those cognitive differences actually are. Now, I have already done individual videos both on the brains of guitar players and the brains of drummers, and I will link them in the description box just in case you missed them. But several of you asked if I would do this specific comparison, so I thought it would be really fun to analyze, and I was pretty curious myself. Before we begin, however, I just wanted to clarify that none of these differences imply superiority in any way. And of course, all musical instruments have immense benefits for the brain, including the ones that we're not talking about today, which I do promise to address in future videos. I also want to point out here that most neuroscience research on music simply compares musicians to non-musicians or examines the effect of training on a singular instrument. There really aren't a lot of studies that directly compare different instrumentalists to one another. So because of that, this analysis comes from synthesizing findings across separate bodies of research and applying what we know about the specific cognitive and motor demands of each instrument, rather than relying on one study that explicitly measured guitar brain versus drum brain, if that makes sense. And of course, all of the citations for the studies that I used to make this video can be found in the description box, just in case you want to read them for yourself. Now, before we talk about how playing these instruments shape our brain, I think it's important to acknowledge that some of these differences were likely there before the instrument itself was even chosen. I have a whole video on this in case you want to dive deeper, but instrument selection is certainly not random. Our personality and how we're wired play a huge role. They aren't the only factors. Access and exposure matter, culture and role models matter, and practical constraints matter. But psychology matters too, and people absolutely come to instruments with pre-existing differences in temperament, motor preferences, attentional style, and how their own nervous system prefers to engage with sound and movement. It's not always the case, but most people are drawn to instruments that already fit how their mind and body work. And training in these instruments only amplifies those differences over time. But let's take a look at what those differences actually are. So the first difference we see is in the motor cortex, which is the strip of brain tissue that is responsible for voluntary movement. Research shows that guitarists tend to develop a highly specialized motor representation of the fingers on the fretting hand, with a larger and more detailed cortical map devoted to fine finger control. This allows for constant micro-adjustments during play. Drummers, by contrast, show a much more symmetrical and evenly distributed organization in the motor cortex. This is because their training emphasizes coordinated control across the arms, legs, and core, supporting timing, power, and multi-limb synchronization. So again, the difference isn't about skill, it's about how the motor cortex chooses to allocate its resources. One is optimized for precision at a very small scale, and the other for integrating many movements into a single action. The next area where we see meaningful differences is in the corpus callosum, which is the large bundle of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain and allows them to communicate. For guitarists, the study showed that this connection supports a kind of division of labor between the hands, the fretting hand, which handles precise spatial positioning, and the strumming or picking hand that controls timing and force. So the corpus callosum helps to synchronize these specialized roles. Now for drummers, this connection actually supports something closer to parallel processing. This is essential since drumming requires all four limbs to move both independently and together, often at extremely high speeds. In fact, studies suggest that drummers tend to show stronger connectivity here than guitarists, which likely allows for faster communication between hemispheres so the brain can keep all four limbs locked into the same rhythmic framework. So in practical terms, in this region of the brain, I think the basic difference here is between integration and independence. The guitarist's brain excels at integration, taking two specialized differing roles and fusing them into one cohesive action, whereas the drummer's brain excels at independence, keeping multiple streams of information distinct so that all four limbs can operate autonomously without interfering with one another. The next region that showed clear differences was the hippocampus, which plays a major role in long-term memory formation and spatial navigation. Not surprisingly, for guitarists, this area appears to adapt to the spatial demands of the fretboard. Because the neck functions like a grid, research shows that this area of the brain starts to build a detailed internal map of the strings, frets, and patterns, essentially turning playing into a form of neural navigation. Drummers, however, rely a lot less on visual spatial mapping and a lot more on procedural memory. Studies suggest that instead of relying on the hippocampus to navigate a layout, their brain shifts resources to the motor centers, specifically regions like the basal ganglia. This allows them to encode the physical feel of repeated movements and rhythmic sequences. This works because they really don't need to memorize where something is, they just need to know how a pattern feels when it's executed correctly. In simple terms, it's a matter of the brain prioritizing either spatial intelligence or kinesthetic intelligence, depending on the demands of the instrument. Okay, the next changes we can see are in the cerebellum, which is involved with things like timing, coordination, and error correction. Studies suggest that for guitarists, this region specifically adapts for sequencing. The more we practice, the more it becomes obsessed with syntax, making sure that rapid-fire notes occur in precise logical order. For drummers, however, the cerebellum adapts specifically for prediction. Research shows that it actually focuses on the space between the beats and constantly micro-corrects the tempo so it never wavers. This allows the brain to not just keep time, but also to enforce stability. Ultimately, I think this just reflects a difference between structure and regulation. The guitarist excels at logic of order and step-by-step progression, whereas the drummer excels at the discipline of pace and holding it all together when things get chaotic. I think the most interesting differences, however, can be found in the prefrontal cortex. This is basically the CEO of our entire brain. It's the center for things like decision-making, planning, and conscious self-monitoring. Believe it or not, research on improvisation shows that with time, guitarists can actually learn to temporarily reduce activity here, which, despite how it sounds, is truly a huge asset. By shutting down their inner editor in this way, they can enter a flow state that allows for spontaneous creativity. In contrast, the drummer's brain rewires itself for inhibitory control. To maintain a steady beat and resist the urge to rush, it strengthens the networks that regulate impulses, essentially creating an entire system of intense neurological discipline. So in everyday life, these changes might start to translate into differences in things like creative ideation and sustained regulation under pressure. But one final difference that I need to mention is in the auditory cortex itself. While we often talk about training by ear, what we're actually training is the brain's sound processing center. The study showed that guitarists develop higher gray matter density in regions linked to pitch and harmonic structure, while drummers show sharper neural coding for temporal precision and rhythmic onset. So, in other words, the brain isn't just learning to help us move differently, it's physically adapting to hear differently, which is actually pretty amazing. So, what is the bottom line here? Well, when we look at the neuroscience, we really don't see one brain that is better than the other. We see two brains that have solved the problem of making music in completely different ways. Both are shaped by the instrument, but again, both are also shaped by the person who chose it. The main thing I notice when analyzing all of this research is that across all of these brain regions, the exact same theme keeps showing up. Guitar training pushes the brain towards precision, structure, and internal mapping, while drumming pushes the brain towards timing, coordination, and real-time regulation of the body. And while there's obviously some crossover, these are some pretty significant distinctions that reflect how different musical demands sculpt the brain over time, as well as amplify the tendencies that we already have. And yes, of course, variables like genre, practice style, and whether we spend more time composing or performing could slightly shift these patterns. But even with those variables, these divergent neurological signatures really are undeniable. But that is it for the analysis. I hope you enjoyed it. It was definitely a labor of love. And even though I am personally a guitar player, I think I was able to stay relatively unbiased, as I would actually love to play drums at some point in the future. And as always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this and which of these instruments that you play, so definitely let me know down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.